Many of you I've known for many years, including my fellow speaker David Trebek, and others of you that I know. Good to see you, friends one and all. I appreciate the chance to say a few things today. I really want to talk in, if I could say that what I generally want to put before you is that there is no such good thing as good public policy deriving out of a poor debate. You do not get good policy, you do not get good decisions by governments out of a substandard, suboptimal, dishonest or inadequate debate. It doesn't happen. You want good outcomes, you need high quality debate. And I essentially wanted to divide my talk loosely into some reflections on two matters, two broad areas. The first is some of my experiences with advocacy groups and what worked. And at its heyday, Mick, and one of the reasons I was delighted to be here today is that I think you've been a tremendous force for quality debate, evidence-based debate, and I salute you for that. At its best, Australian farm advocacy has been enormously powerful and very beneficial, not just for agriculture, but for the nation. And then secondly, I just want to contextualise the situation that I think you face. I'm largely out of it now. I have an interest as a farmer, and I now find I've got a son who wants to follow me on the land, so I suppose the interest continues. But as I watch it all, and as I watched it as somebody who's a passionate believer, not just in Australia, that's a bit trite to say, but in the whole Western liberal democratic tradition and the freedoms that it's given us, I want to say to you, I think we're caught up in a maelstrom that is extremely serious and will call for clarity of thought, of courage, of reasonableness from our leaders of a level we haven't seen for decades, and that's going to be very hard to find. And I hope in a perhaps forlorn and unrealistic way that perhaps my humble words today can encourage some of you to recognise that, to step up yourselves even further than you are, maybe encourage others around you. We need leaders like never before, and not just in agriculture. The West is in a mess. I don't know how many of you really understand how serious the international indebtedness problem is. You've got the sovereign debt crisis that countries can't cope with now, countries like Greece that can't afford to feed their kids at school. Parents are too broke to put anything in the refrigerator, and they can't afford a social welfare program to meet the need anymore. 58% of them can't get a job, young Greeks. That's their sovereign debt problem, you know, at 160%, but nearly all European and American countries are at 100% debt to GDP. And in coming years, their unfunded liabilities going forward takes the debt loading like that, while the demographic cliff and poorer economic outcomes and performance takes the income like that, and the gap widens to a point where it is an utter mess. Australia is one of the few countries, by dint of better government over many decades than many Australians recognise, we are too cynical by half. We really are. The fact is that federal governments have left this country surprisingly well placed, notwithstanding that we've had some shockers, to take part in the happening part of the world in the next century. But these are really serious. You know, you look around, it sort of puts you in mind of that old yarn about the two naval ratings during the Second World War. They finally get some leave, having docked after a very dangerous sea crossing in the UK, Southampton. They stagger down to the pub, get themselves well and truly written off, thrown out on the street at closing time, and one of them says, "Hey, mate, we've got a problem. We're lost. We don't know where we are." And the other bloke says, yeah, look, this bloke walking down the street, he'll be able to tell us where we are. And as the Admiral of the British fleet, covered in scrambled egg and frightfully tall and erect and all the rest of it, and they pull him up and say, we're lost. Can you tell us how to find our way back to the... To which he responds, the question is not where you gentlemen are, the question is, do you know who I am? And one of the Australians looks at the other and says, no, we're in real trouble. We don't know where we are, and he doesn't know who he is. We need clarity of thought and courage and leadership as never before. Let me come to some observations. This issue of rural advocacy plays out in the minds of people in rural areas, I suspect, in rural areas in a very big way. I understand, Mick, tomorrow you're doing some work on what you've discovered about how Australians feel. I had an interesting experience, farmers feel. I had an interesting experience. I was asked to speak at Marcus Oldham a couple of years ago. Now, that's a pretty premier agricultural training institute, if there is one in the country. And I said to them, look, I'm only going to talk for about 10 minutes and then I'd like you to interact. Tell me what you think and ask questions and what have you. Well, every single question went to the issue of why are farmers not more respected by governments? Why are they not heard by policymakers? What do we do about it? That's where they went. It was playing on their minds. And I broadly answered by saying, well, you've got two problems. Impossible to do much about one of them. Relatively speaking, we're few in number. You add up all the farmers in Australia, you'd have one federal electorate. That's about it. Even in the seat of Guida, which was one of the most purely rural electorates when I was a member, I think the farm vote, depending on how you sliced it and diced it, was somewhere between 13 and 18%, even in that electorate. Every farmer could have voted against me and I'd have still been the member for Guida. That's the way it actually worked in terms of the numbers. That's problem number one. But the other problem is, of course, you know, I remember a cynic about the farm sector saying to me one day, oh, John, you know, trying to get farmers to agree is like trying to herd cats. You divide on everything. So there are a couple of observations. That reminds me of the New South Wales Farmers Association putting on a wool growers meeting out at Lightning Ridge in my electorate in the mid-90s. And we had dinner afterwards in the bowling club out there, and there were 3 tables with 10 on each. So there were 30 people having dinner. And during question time, one of them kept firing, actually Mr. Barlow, no, he knows that area well. They kept firing questions, one of the tables. All the questions seemed to come from that one. I couldn't help in the end. I just cheerfully said, there's 10 of you on that table and you seem to have 10 different opinions. And one of them shot back quickly, no, as a matter of fact, we've got 11. And so that is in itself a real issue. But let me just say that on the good news front, can I say, as I said to you at the beginning, at its best, the farm lobby in this country has been unbelievably effective. When I was contemplating in 1993 becoming the Minister for Primary Industries, I went in 1989, 1993, Election Day. It was an interesting day for me. Our 3rd child arrived at midday in the middle of the day. Had to be a girl making an entrance like that. I was pretty distracted by all of this and got us a good headline. Local paper, picture of Julia and me with little Georgie the next week. Block headlines, National's wife goes to Labor on election day. But that was the unlosable election that we lost, you see, and Bruce Lloyd, who'd been the Deputy Leader of the party and Shadow Minister of Ag, said he wasn't going to stand again. Tim Fisher rang me and said, you should put your hat up, you won't win the Deputy Leadership, but you need to show people that you're interested for the future. I thought about it for a while and decided to do it, but in great trepidation. Why? Because it brought with it the primary industry portfolio. Why was I trepidatious about that? Because of the way farmers are so hard sometimes to lock into a policy position. At that stage, it was, of course, the wool industry in deep, deep crisis. And you'd had the Garneau report and what to do with the stockpile, those issues floating around. Anyway, I ended up in the role. But as part of it all, one of the things that was happening, and this is where I get to really highlight what you can do when you're focused, was that the NFF had become massively influential in Canberra. It was writing very high-quality papers. In fact, David's going to talk about this, and he summarised it. He played an honourable role in it. And they were listened to. Somebody, I think, said something to the effect of, I don't want to steal your thunder, but the NFF was there very early and very powerfully, and they were having a very big influence on everybody's thinking. And specifically, for me as somebody who was interested in good policy, I was never very interested in politics, I have to tell you, but always very interested in good policy. What was interesting here was that they were really mounting credible arguments for tax reform, for industrial relations reform, for tariff reform, the whole bit, economic restraint, living within your means. There was a brilliant paper that made me an overnight convert to the idea of a rebatable indirect tax system. Well, not overnight, with a long paper. I remember taking it with me on holidays in the south coast of New South Wales and profoundly shaped my thinking about tax. It was a very, very well constructed, if dense and complicated paper. But I made sure I was across it. And the interesting thing was that at that stage, the National Party was going through great convulsions over what it stood for, because it had been a party that had essentially centred around statutory marketing, orderly marketing. And here we were being challenged by the chief farm advocates to dry out, if you like, for want of a better term, and get real about the real issues and to recognise that we shared, broadly speaking, with the rest of the Australian economy, a very great interest in sound economic management. And the debates that raged between the old guard and the new guard, as we called one another, they were long and they were ferocious and they were tumultuous and they were often personal. And I don't know whether there's ever been such a period of high-quality debate in those party rooms since, because it got better and better and better and better. And with the help of the NFF, farm policy essentially won because it was good policy for the nation. And by the time we got the government in 1996, we were ready to join wholeheartedly with our coalition partners in tackling the big issues that had been identified as critical to the farm sector's future and the nation's future. And that very first cabinet meeting, when John Howard said, 11th of March 1996, he said, you know, the books are far worse than we ever said in our propaganda during the election campaign. Politicians always say the mess was bigger than we thought. It really was. He said, and he was grey. I remember the look on his face. He said, this is going to be impossible, but we're going to have to do something about it. And he said, there'll be a raising gang, Peter Costello, John Fay, Mike Wooldridge, you look after the spending portfolios, John Anderson, the spending portfolios, John Anderson do the economic portfolios. It was the most grinding work I've ever had or ever been involved in. The farm advocacy groups played a major role in the commitment of that government and in the unity of that government pulling together to pay down debt, ultimately resulted in the country being in surplus at the time of the GFC. That's a big accolade, but it's deserved, and it happens to be true. It played a major role. It brought enough people on side to stick for long enough to make the tough decisions. Let me then extract an industry grouping, if you like, out of it and tell you about how they, by dint of strong and courageous leadership and really good research-based evidence being put before governments, influenced that government in me and my department and my office and my party room and ultimately the cabinet room. And it's the dairy industry. And I think particularly of Pat Rowley. And when I think of Australian farm leaders with grit and courage and determination and humility, Pat Rowley stands tall. But the dairy industry was to play a big role in what happened in those early days, incidentally as a very minor piece of history. The very first piece of legislation introduced to the House of Representatives by the incoming coalition government in 1996, the very first piece we'd introduced for 13 years was the Dairy Adjustment Bill, which I introduced just after we got into government. But in three areas, just by way of illustration. One was on the issue of research and development. Now, this is being recorded, isn't it? Yes. There's a bit of sensitivity here, because I'm not meant to talk about what happens in cabinet rooms. But one of the, even now, but one of the great raging debates, you know, those of you in the farm sector will think the hair that got away was that we were going to make some savings by scrapping the diesel fuel rebate. Remember that one? Now, that was an ugly enough and a difficult enough debate, and we actually had, it was very interesting, government departments saying it's a subsidy. And I was arguing, you know, it's not a subsidy, it's a non-application of a tax on production. And then when the Labor Party said that they wanted to find the savings because it was a subsidy, the bureaucracy 2 or 3 years ago was arguing, it's not a subsidy, it's a non-application of it. I thought, gosh, must have won something somewhere. But that wasn't the most vicious debate in agriculture. You know, the toughest debate of all was actually over R&D. The bureaucrats, you remember that, the bureaucrats were arguing it was a farmer benefit. See? And farmers should pay for it. Sunset industry, all that stuff. Well, the dairy industry had assembled its facts like no other industry, and they actually put their money where their mouth was. They ran advertisements pointing to the 100,000 value-adding jobs held by people who were not farmers on the back of the dairy industry's production, and asked the logical question, are these farmer benefits? How do you collect the revenues from some other part of the community? How do you capture it when many of the beneficiaries aren't farmers? It was a very powerful argument. And we won that debate. And the R&D, I hadn't put them in place, so I could say no other country has a better model for R&D, I still believe this, than the dollar-for-dollar research grant arrangements that were put in place by a previous regime. Now, I have to tell you in the end, not supposed to say this, but in the end, despite all the rational arguments, the days of arguments over it went on and on and on and on. Keith Perrett's here. Remember, there were great big reserves, and all those Treasury and finance officials could see them, and they were watering at the mouth at getting their hands on them. In the end, it boiled down to a very tense meeting with the PM chairing it, saying, how strongly do you feel about this, John? We've heard the arguments, but we need those savings. And I said, I'm sorry, it's a line I just will not cross. To me, it's even more important than the diesel fuel rebate. So there you go, bit of history for you. But the dairy industry performance there was magnificent. Then there was another hot issue, a very emotive one indeed. Importation of foodstuffs and the whole question of AQUIS's role. You remember that debate. And what landed on my desk the very first day after I was sworn in as a minister was an application to import cooked chicken meat. And if you remember that debate? Well, all hell broke loose. I have to be fair and say that the chicken industry lobby were they basically decent people. I got nothing against them. They mounted a very, very effective and powerful campaign and what have you. And I think, essentially speaking, were well-meaning. But the particular issue there was that, of course, Australia, with the incredibly strong driving support of the farm lobby, had signed up to the new WTO rules. And I wasn't the decision maker on the imported cooked chicken meat from Thailand. The director of quarantine was, who was the secretary of the department. And I stood there waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for the farm lobby group to say, hang on, we actually argued for these trade reforms and we knew there'd be some downside, but overall we argued for them and we support them because there's going to be upside. You know, the one sector that spoke up was the dairy industry. They again took out full-page ads saying, look what we've won in terms of further concession and trade access throughout Asia. I don't know how they knew the debate was, well, they knew that debate was going on. I don't know how the one about the R&D. Somebody must have said something to someone. But it was very, very useful. They were prepared. They were very courageous. They said, look, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. You know, you're going to have to recognise trade's a two-way thing. Remember the other issue that was running at that time was imported cooked pork. And the Canadian trade attaché came into me one day and he said, you know, Australia and Canada are great friends, so if you decide against, I can't remember whether that was pork or salmon, there were so many of those issues. Anyway, whatever it was. He said, if you decide against it, he said, we're not going to raise a fuss, and to be honest, I can tell you now, we won't take you to the WTO. Our relationship's too important. He said, just be aware, though, that at the moment, we're taking $20 million, you're taking $20 million of our agricultural product, and we're taking $400 million of yours, and there could be the odd sort of $200 million sugar contract that might go to Brazil. Trade is a two-way thing, keep it in mind. You know, those are the sorts of issues that go on behind closed doors, but the dairy industry was there. Courage, raw courage, and I admired them for it. It wasn't popular. I remember a couple of them telling me how much flack they'd copped from some of the other industry sectors that disagreed, but they stood. In the end, of course, what we did with the chicken meat one was place Weybridge in the UK established that to kill every pathogen, you had to sort of basically char grill it, and, you know, in the end it was utterly inedible and none of it ever came in. Didn't stop me getting a letter from a lady in Western New South Wales, you know, thumbnail dipped in tar, yellow faded old foolscap paper. Dear Mr. Anderson, you are the greatest mongrel Minister for Primary Industries the country has ever had. My husband and I have just been to a wedding in Melbourne where they served up this disgusting dish called Thai chicken made from chicken from Thailand. How could you ever let this in? You could smell it. So I checked with Customs and I was able to write back with full authority and lots of graphs and papers about importation. No chicken meat from Thailand has ever come into Australia. So the dish you enjoyed so much, perhaps the enclosed Women's Weekly, recipe will be more agreeable to you the next time you feel like a plate of Thai chicken. She didn't reply. So just a couple of insights, and then the other one where they were so very, very effective. Do you remember the dairy deregulation issue? And Pat Rowley came to meet me in Sydney while I was still Minister for Agriculture, which must have been in about late 98, I suppose, or mid-98, and said, look, the states, it's inevitable, they'll have to give up the regulations that constrain interstate trade on milk. It's not a federal issue, but we need federal help. I remember going, white, what do you want this time, Pat? We worked through the options. He said it's going to be enormously dislocating because the industry now is producing in areas where it just won't be able to compete with other areas. You know the case. And he said, you know, look, you as a wheat farmer would find it pretty amazing if you couldn't sell wheat in Queensland. Mind you, I don't think they would in Queensland, but... and, you know, we find it pretty amazing, our Victorians find it amazing they can't sell in the Sydney market. It's going to collapse, but there'll be a lot of pain. We need your help. So we worked through the options and came up with the idea of capturing the price difference. Do you remember that? I can't remember how many cents a litre it was. Anybody from the dairy industry now? 11 cents, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, we worked all of this up and thought, well, that's the way to get an adjustment package together and do some justice, help the industry restructure, those who haven't got a future out of it. It's a fair and reasonable Australian thing to do. Warren Truss, I think, became the Minister for Ag. I'd moved on. It was after the 1999 election. I thought, I'd better float this one in Cabinet. So we waited, and Howard was a brilliant chair of Cabinet. Absolutely top class. I've never served with a better chairman of a board, so to speak. Courteous, efficient, always there on time, gave everybody their say, and so on and so forth. But he, you know, and broadly stuck the proper process with just enough flexibility to move occasionally. So end of a very long and difficult cabinet meeting, I said, oh, there's just one other issue. I just want to alert cabinet. What's that, John? The dairy industry. They're going to have to deregulate, you know, and I'm sure no one in cabinet would object to that. You need to understand it's got nothing to do with us. It's a state-based process, but there's going to be immense pain. And to help them out, I would like to support the dairy industry in a proposition they put to me that we capture the difference. We put an 11-cent charge on supermarket milk and we use it for an adjustment package. Well, you've never heard a deathly silence like it around the cabinet table. People put their pens down quietly. They looked at me, they looked at the Prime Minister, and I thought, who's going to break the ice? And it was Richard Alston. He just quietly said, you want what, John? And John Howard, sort of seizing the difficulty of the moment, said, well, it sounds like that's a matter for discussion on a later date. But we got it up. We got it up. There were people in our own ranks, I wore a lot of pain on that, who said, John, don't do this because it'll create the opportunity for people to say the feds are deregulating, they're the cause of all this pain, the radio shock jocks will eat us, it'll be just terrible. Make the state governments own the thing that they're doing. And I said, no, we can't. There's going to be too much pain. We've actually got to help and get involved. So we did, and I think it was the right thing to do. So another example, you see, clear-sighted, unbelievably courageous leadership at great cost. Real leadership always involves great cost. And those of you who know Pat Rowley know how hard and tough that actually was for the man. He deserves enormous recognition in the Hall of Fame of rural leaders. Okay, so that's just touching on a few things. I've been asked to say something about was it different in other portfolios. Can I say to you, no, not really. I think the truth is that in all portfolios that I had anything to do with, including as Deputy PM, where people would come in with difficult issues from every portfolio, the reality is that you sometimes got tremendous advocacy, very effective, facts-based. They understood the government. I mean, rule number one is to understand where the government's coming from and where your minister's coming from. You know, and if you've got a sympathetic minister, don't make it harder by letting your industry divide all over the place. It's impossible for him then. How does he take a position to cabinet if he knows that half the industry is going to turn around and flog him to death on it? I laboriously put together some more flexibility in the fixed release schedule for the wool industry. Laboriously. We pulled them all out from all the purchasers from all over the world, said we don't want any more shocks. We know that this industry's been through great turmoil. We don't want any more uncertainty. Can we agree on a way forward? We agreed on it, and 6 months later the Western Australians convinced the Prime Minister we ought to change it. And in one of my most spectacular failures, I lost the argument at the cabinet table, and we let the fixed release schedule go. Massive uncertainty. What then happened was that Rural Press did a survey of wool growers right across the country and found, in fact, the government had it wrong. Most growers believed that we had it right before that change. But the industry split all over the place. I see Peter Corish here. If I wanted a consistent view for the fibre industry at one end of the bookend, the cotton industry, I knew I could get it. And I knew they would lock in behind their leadership, and if they didn't, the leadership would deal with the dissenters. Could never have said the same about the wool industry. Sorry if there are any woolies here. It was chaotic. It was chaotic. It really was. And anyway, that's the way it goes. All right, look, just if I may then, just a few reflections on where we're at now, because I think this is really important stuff. It's getting more and more difficult to stand up take a position, win an argument on the merits. I think you'd all agree with that. And, you know, I think I'd just like to say a couple of things about that. We're seeing massive cultural change in Western society. Over the last 50 years, you've had the abandonment of the idea of truth. Now, that sounds deeply philosophical. Well, it's meant to be. It's meant to be. Truth is now something that is relative. That is to say, if something's true for me, then that's truth for me. If something's true for you, that's true for you. And it got this fellow, Nick Cater, who writes now, was the editor, I think, of The Australian, wasn't he? He's now writing freelance for it. Read his article yesterday or the day before. He said, this has led to pick-a-box journalism, where the media will put up two people on a subject, and call it balance, with opposing views, and say that both are equally true. You see what a disaster that actually is? You see it all the time now. You'll see somebody who actually knows something about the science of, to pick out an example, genetically modified foodstuffs. And then you'll see a green activist. Well, actually, you know, most of the media, you know who they'll give the greater weighting to, don't you? Where's the objectivity? Do we believe science or do we not? It'd actually be even more philosophical for a moment. G.K. Chesterton was one of the most brilliant writers that the Western world's ever produced, and he made the observation once, when people stop believing in God, they'll believe in anything. And that's about where we've got to. This is actually a really, really serious problem for governments, for political leaders, and for advocacy groups. It's really hard now to cut through with facts. And this problem of what might be called moral relativism, spin is the word that's usually applied to it now, that's the response, I suppose, coupled with social media, is, I believe, potentially dynamite for, well, not potentially, I think it's already very troublesome for us. People now select their news. They purchase it, even on the free-to-airs. I was getting changed. I had to give a speech in Melbourne about 18 months ago, and I'd come down from home and I wasn't feeling fresh for the speech, so I was having a shower. I was just watching the television while I was getting into a suit, and it was midday news on one of the free-to-airs. We got, I timed it, 25 seconds on a really serious problem in the Middle East that was flying at that time, and then we got 6.5 minutes on the jury deliberating on Michael Jackson's his doctor played in his death. Why? That's people purchasing their news. It means they hear what they want to hear, and they reinforce their own prejudices. And that's alive and well in rural advocacy today as well. In fact, the old saying, you will have heard it, I may disagree totally with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it. You heard that? It's a famous saying attributed to Voltaire. No, he didn't actually say it. It was his biographer who said it. But there's two really important takes out of that. The first is, I may disagree with you, but I respect your right as a person to have your view. And the second thing is, we will get a better policy outcome if we get all of the arguments, even yours, though I detest it, on the table. Does that stack up? Certainly does for me. But is that what happens now? Much of what passes for debate now, including in farm sectors, and particularly when we get tied up with Greens, really reflects that. And there are three, I would put it to you, disastrous outcomes, disastrous problems that arise from it. The first is that you don't get all the ideas on the table for honest discussion. The second is that you cannot then get optimal policy outcomes because you haven't got all the arguments. And the third, deeply embedded, related problem is that good people feel they can't put their hand up and put their perspective out there because they're going to get shot at. There is a person in this very room now, and he'll know who he is, a man I have enormous regard for, that I wanted to see in high political office. And he was attacked one day by a member of Parliament under parliamentary privilege, and he came to me and he said, I'm not going to have anything to do with it if that's what happens. But you see it all the time. I was talking to a bloke up in Armidale the other day, a tremendous bloke, who knows farming inside out. I said to him, you don't belong to the National Party, you belong to the New South Wales Farmers Association? He said, no, I don't. I said, why not? He said, because I don't want to get shot at. I hate politics. I hate the way people play the man, not the ball. Okay? It's a real problem. That is part of the price we are paying for moral relativism and social media. And we need to be aware of it. What's the answer? The answer can only be the very thing I've alluded to as being the central quality of some of those more successful advocates. It requires courage. It requires an ability to mount your case because you know your case. You'll only know your case if you've heard all sides of the argument. It requires vision too. It requires vision. We've got a massive problem with the media, particularly, I'll be blunt about this, much of the rural media. There are very honourable exceptions, probably some of them in this room. You know, I think of some of the ABC people on Country Hour, and I think what a fantastic job they do. But there are many, many others. There was an ABC person, Identity, in the northwest of the state during the last election. I was chairing Barnaby Joyce's campaign. It's quite interesting to be semi-back in the saddle. One of the things I had was an incredible stock of information because every man and his dog was polling the seat to see who had credibility, who was being listened to, and what the issues were. The ABC up there was frothing on at the mouth about issues that no one outside a small select group was even talking about. And they were giving voice to people that I knew from our own research were not being listened to and had no credibility and were not seen, while they were ignoring others that I knew from the research did have the respect of the community. They weren't being objective, they weren't even being intelligent about it. These are big problems. So, summary. Sorry, I've rabbited on for a long time. These are very difficult times for the West. They're very challenging times for agriculture. However, Australia is strongly placed, really strongly placed, for a whole variety of reasons, including the fact that you've had much more prudent federal government on three major occasions. I may as well be blunt. Menzies, Hawke and Howard, those 3 eras. Financially, we are still in sound shape. The current bunch have got a tough job now turning around the culture of entitlement, getting everything back under control, but as long as they can do that, we're well set for Asia. There is every need for and every place for gutsy and courageous leadership, and Mick, the sort of thing that you and so many people have done in this room in really seeking to get to the bottom of the facts is critically important to this process. I commend you in it. I encourage you in it. Please keep doing it, but be clear-sighted about it. We need people of vision in agriculture. We need them in Australia as never before. Thanks very much.